Hi, everyone. It's a big, big day. It's 4 o'clock in New York. Quote, I have a blockbuster Trump story. 6 words that would put in motion just about everything that happened next. A scramble from Trump allies to suppress a story that could have landed like a bombshell in the 2016 campaign. Those words were in a text message sent from Keith Davidson. Keith Davidson is the attorney for both of the women at the heart of the story, Playboy Playmate Karen McDougall and porn star Stormy Daniels. It was a text sent to then editor of the National Inquirer, Dylan Howard. Now, we mention this because Davidson is on the stand right now on day 9 of the Donald Trump election interference hush money trial, with explosive testimony being given right now about his dealings with AMI and Donald Trump's innermost circle. Earlier today, he told the court and the jury that Dylan Howard texted him back a response, quote, talk first thing. I will get you more than anyone for it. You know why. Davidson says that he understood even back then that the owner of the National Enquirer, AMI owner David Pecker, and Donald Trump were good friends. Just 2 weeks after those texts were exchanged, Karen McDougall met with Dylan Howard. It was where Karen McDougall alleged that she had an affair with Donald Trump that went on for, quote, several weeks to months. Now, AMI initially declined to pick up McDougall's story, returning to the bargaining table for it only when ABC News wanted it. They expressed interest in talking to McDougall. But what ABC wanted was for her to tell her story, something McDougall didn't want to do, Davidson testified. Now, in late July, Dylan Howard texted Davidson, quote, get me a price on McDougall, all in, consulting gig, perhaps as a fitness expert thrown into the mix. With Karen McDougall deciding between going public with her story with ABC News or signing a deal to bury her story with the National Enquirer, Dylan Howard wrote her lawyer, Keith Davidson, this, quote, we are going to lay it on thick for her. To which her lawyer, Keith Davidson, said, quote, good. Throw in an ambassadorship for me. I'm thinking Isle of Man, a joke referring to the fact that Karen McDougall's deal with AMI would help Donald Trump, who was running for president. And when the deal was finally done, Keith Davidson said he called Michael Cohen. He said, out of, quote, professional courtesy, to tell him that a deal involving Michael Cohen's client, Donald Trump, had closed. So then it came time for Keith Davidson to describe what happened with his other client, of course, Stormy Daniels. Davidson told the jury today that the release of the Access Hollywood tape breathed new life into Stormy Daniels' allegations that she'd had an affair. He testified that that tape, quote, had tremendous influence on the appeal of Stormy's story. He said that it then fell to him to negotiate the deal to silence Stormy Daniels with Michael Cohen once AMI backed out. The attorney representing both Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougall pulling the curtain back on how the entire scheme to suppress stories that would have damaged Donald Trump is where we begin today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us at the table, former U.S. Attorney and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Harry Litman's here. He was back inside the courthouse today. Also back at the table, special correspondent for The Hollywood Reporter, Lachlan Cartwright, is back with us. He's the former executive editor for American Media Inc., AMI. He worked with David Pecker and Dylan Howard. Also joining us, former top official at the Department of Justice, MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissman. And at the courthouse for us, once again, NBC News correspondent, my friend Vaughn Hilliard. Vaughn, I start with you. This was another day where every time I read my notes, I had to stop. People bumped. I was that person on the sidewalk, right, staring at my phone. Some really gobsmackingly extraordinary new information for people on the outside of the hush money scheme. Talk about the testimony today.
Right, in the text messages that were transferred between Keith Davidson, who was the attorney representing Stormy Daniels, and Michael Cohen, and Dylan Howard, the editor-in-chief of the National Enquirer, just bringing us in real time, hour by hour, as these deliberations were unfolding, particularly around the reveal of the Access Hollywood tape and the suggestion that the campaign was all but over at that point. But I think an important takeaway here, is the conversation, Nicole, that you and I, we were all having coming into this trial. What corroborating testimony and evidence would there be to Michael Cohen? We now have David Pecker and Keith Davidson who are corroborating and providing backing to the claims that Michael Cohen has made publicly heading into this trial here. And just Keith Davidson, just this afternoon alone, makes a direct reference to Donald Trump as part of the Karen McDougall arrangement. As part of the contract in paragraph 3, the prosecution asked Keith Davidson the question that, quote, Karen grants her life rights to the subject manager regarding an affair she had with a married man. Was there a particular married man you understood this to apply to? Davidson responded, yes. Asked who? Davidson responded, Donald Trump, as it pertained to Stormy Daniels. On October 11, 2016, Stormy Daniels had entered into a contract through Keith Davidson with Michael Cohen. And as part of that, there were pseudonyms that were given, not only to Stormy Daniels, Peggy Peterson, but also a pseudonym, David Dennison. Who is David Dennison? Well, that individual was identified explicitly by Keith Davidson today as being Donald Trump. So now the jury has heard from this individual who says that Donald Trump was a party to this contract. Whether he was explicitly a part of it, that is still wait to be seen from Keith Davidson. But we know that he is so far providing detailed testimony about his conversations with Dylan Howard, the editor-in-chief of the National Inquirer, and Michael Cohen. And we should expect testimony, even here within the next half hour, about October 27th. Those literal days when Michael Cohen and Donald Trump were on the phone as the wire transfer was being initiated. These are details that Keith Davidson, for the first time, could begin to publicly share here and in front of the jury, Nicole.
And Vaughn, you were traveling with Mike Pence. I was here in the studio most days covering these final frantic days of the campaign alongside our former colleague, Brian Williams. I remember each of these news cycles, and I think it's time to probably build out this timeline. I want to turn to our lawyers on what you just articulated, but I want to ask you one more question about the work that the prosecution did laying out motive. And it's this thing that wasn't unspoken. It was spoken. It was about ambassadorships. Now, who gives ambassadorships? Only one human being on planet Earth gives American ambassadorships, and they're the American president. Let me read you this. This is from a text message from Dylan. Quote, we're going to lay it on thick for her, Karen McDougall. At this point, Karen was teetering between two competing deals, and we had requested a meeting where each entity could make a pitch as to why they were the correct avenue for Karen. How did you respond? Good. Throw in an ambassadorship for me. I'm thinking Isle of Man. Prosecutor asked what that meant. Quote, I was making a joke. I don't think the Isle of Man is even a country or that they have an ambassador. It was a reference to Trump's candidacy. What did you mean by that? Question. Answer from Keith Davidson. Quote, this would help his candidacy. Question from the prosecutor. Is it safe to assume that from your joke, that it was your belief that if you were this close to a deal, it would somehow benefit the candidate, Donald Trump? Keith Davidson, yes.
We're going to lay it on thick. That was one of those text messages. We're going to lay it on thick for her to execute this deal. You know, you've been a part of campaigns. I've covered a number of them. And if anybody covering these campaigns or the public at large should become familiar with the details, right? Legality aside, right? Just politically here, of the lengths to which somebody is going through in order to tamp down or cover up a story, it's laid out in the form of those text messages that we were not all privy to in 2016. These didn't come into light until well into Donald Trump's presidency. And so, when you ask about the stakes here and right, joking about an ambassadorship, real or not, I think that for us, I was just talking with producer Dan, I was on the road with back in 2016 as we were going through all of this. And if we had known in real time the lengths to which Donald Trump, and perhaps even Mike Pence knew the lengths to which Donald Trump was going to suppress these salacious stories about him, I think that perhaps the country would be at a different point in its reckoning with where it finds itself and its moral compass when it comes to our politics today than it does here in the year of 2024. Yeah,
I mean, and that, Lachlan, is like the $64 million question that we'll have to grapple with forever. And I think in the opening, the prosecutors lay that out as, we'll never know right? We'll never know the political impact of the suppression of these stories, the silencing of these women. But we do know from this testimony today that Trump's motive was to keep them away from the voters. I want to read a little bit more from the exchanges between Dylan Howard, who we talked about last week, who's unavailable to come to New York and be part of this trial because of some health issues, right?
Spinal injuries is what has been told to the jury.
And Keith Davidson. So they put up for the jury a July 28th, 2016 text message between Dylan Howard and Keith Davidson that says, "I need this to happen." Prosecutors say, "How did you interpret that?" Keith Davidson says, "I suppose I interpreted it as he, Dylan Howard, wanted it to happen." It being the deal between Karen McDougall and AMI, asked the prosecutors. Keith Davidson, "Yes, sir." The need for Karen McDougall to go with AMI isn't just competitive, is it? It's about what would happen to her story about Trump.
And you can sense the urgency here in the messages going back and forth. I mean, Dylan Howard loved texting, and I can almost hear his voice as these texts are read in court. But there is this situation going on with ABC and Keith Davidson's almost playing off ABC against AMI. But there is this urgency to make sure that Karen McDougall's story is purchased off the market and by American media.
Tell me about what was being shelved in real time. I mean, you have this epiphany because you're on the outside of the collusive relationship between Pecker and Trump to aid his candidacy. But tell me what you would imagine Dylan Howard's dealings would have been like, just having known him.
Well, Dylan Howard and Keith Davidson were incredibly close, and this has been brought up by David Pecker in testimony, saying that he was his, one of his top sources. And Keith Davidson, was in contact with Dylan Howard, I want to say, at least a few times a week. And so I could see behind the scenes, both of them hashing out this deal, trying to figure out a way that, it would be good for both men. There was actually a situation where I was out with Dylan Howard during this period, and he passed me a watch, and I thought it was a knockoff Rolex, and I was wearing it, and we were sort of having a good time. And I came home, and I put the watch over, and I left it on, and he called me the next day in a panic, and he said, "Where's that watch?" And I said, I've got it here. What's the problem? He said, that's a real Rolex. And I said, "Sorry?" He said, "Yeah, it's a gift from Keith." So that's how close that they were. That there were gifts going on, there were presents back and forth, and you can see why there was that close relationship, because Keith Davidson played an integral role in helping to deliver both Karen McDougall and Stormy Daniels.
Andrew Weissman, jump in on the legal significance of Keith Davidson's testimony today.
I sort of have a different take slightly than what Vaughn said, and some of it may just be wording, which is, I think that the start of this trial is so powerful because it is wrong for us. I think we have to recalibrate the lens through which we were thinking about this case. We were thinking Michael Cohen is the star witness, and how will they corroborate Michael Cohen? And I really think the way to think about this case is made very much without Michael Cohen. I mean, this is so corroborated. And it's not just that you have David Pecker and now Keith Davidson. Their stories are just hand and glove. I mean, they fit together so perfectly, and they tell a complex story. I mean, something that if you were making it up, it wouldn't be with these kinds of intricacies. And then also it's completely corroborated, particularly with respect to Mr. Davidson, by so many texts and email exchanges and the written documents. I mean, this is one where with almost every question, there's then a reference to a document so that the jurors can see there's no question about what he is saying. It is completely backed up. So by the time you get to Michael Cohen, I think that the way that I think that this is going to be summed up on by the prosecution is to say, you know what, if Michael Cohen had said anything else, you would have thought he was lying. I mean, it is so completely consistent with this story. The whole idea that Michael Cohen had to essentially take over the role of the National Enquirer because they no longer were willing to be, as we heard from Mr. Pecker, the bank. And so there was this scramble at the last minute about how Michael Cohen would come up with the money to replace the money that National Enquirer had been focusing on. The other person who may end up being a witness is you heard a lot about the general counsel of AMI, who basically put the kibosh on this when he learned about what was going on from David Pecker. You have testimony today that the general counsel of AMI instructed Davidson that he had to deal with Michael Cohen, meaning the National Enquirer wanted no part of this because they understood the campaign finance problem. And that's the piece of evidence that the jury has not heard, but we're aware of, which is Dylan Howard at the end of the day saying, you know what, at least I'm going to get a pardon for what we just did. That he was very aware of the illegality, the campaign illegality of this entire scheme.
Andrew Weissman, we're talking about Dylan Howard again. It's day 9. I think about 8 of them have been dominated by one end of a conversation between David Pecker and Dylan Howard, now between Keith Davidson, the attorney for Karen McDougall, and Stormy Daniels. Why do you think that he isn't showing up? And I'm not suggesting the illness or the injury isn't real, but why not by Zoom or by telephone if he's so central to the very credible testimony of David Pecker and Keith Davidson?
Well, I'm sure he has counsel, and I'm pretty sure his counsel is like saying, you know, keep your head down unless they can force you to testify. In other words, he obviously, by engaging in this scheme, is not particularly concerned about the public good or the public interest. I mean, one of the strengths of David Pecker was his complete lack of remorse for what when you think about what he is testifying to, it's intentional defamation and election fraud for the winning candidate. And so, you know, you can imagine that Dylan Howard and with the advice of counsel is saying, I'm going to keep my head down. He is in a jurisdiction that it would be hard for New York. Remember, this is, you know, New York State, to reach him if he is actually in Australia and has an inability to travel. That all of that would make it very hard. But I agree with you. It's not quite Hamlet without Hamlet, but I don't know, maybe it's like Macbeth without Iago.
See, you're so fancy. I was thinking the January 6th Select Committee without Mark Meadows, but we had his text. But you're so fancy. I'm like the uncultured Visigoth at the table. But let me ask you to pick up on this, and let me read you a little bit more of these exchanges. So this is the prosecutor. Did you have an understanding as to why AMI would be purchasing a story it didn't intend to print? Keith Davidson, there were 2 reasons. One was they were trying to build Karen McDougall into a brand and they didn't want to diminish her reputation. The second was an unspoken understanding that there was a close affiliation between AMI and Donald Trump, and they wouldn't run her story because it would tend to hurt Donald Trump. Prosecutor, and when you say hurt Donald Trump, you mean hurt Donald Trump's campaign. You've now, again, got a second central player. Pecker was a co-conspirator with Donald Trump. Keith Davidson represented the 2 women whose stories were bought and silenced, saying, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's quite important. You've got a kind of a spiraling narrative here where they're reinforcing from different sides. And maybe the most important evidence of this overall intent was from Donald Trump's mouth. No one's mentioned it yet, but we had a C-SPAN narrative where he denies any sexual contact with them, but also says, if 5% of the electorate believe this, 10% of the electorate, I'm going to lose. So that's really coming from his mouth. On Michael Cohen, look, I basically agree with Andrew. That's the goal. They're trying very hard to have a sort of 360-degree corroboration of everything he has to say. It's been really interesting in court. He's been trashed repeatedly. I'm sure the jury is very interested to hear from him. Davidson today said he spoke with Cohen because nobody wanted to, and he was sort of forced to it. He's really, in many ways, been disparaged already, and I'm sure the jury is hungry. They have a lot, but there are going to come some points, I think, at the actual documents where Cohen apart from that little snippet of tape with Trump, kind of stands alone. But what they are trying to build, and so far successfully, is a case that a closing argument they can say two things about Cohen. First, corroborate it like crazy, and second, what are they trying to suggest here? Why would he, even if you don't think he's a honorable guy, what's he doing? 130,000 when you know he can't spend a nickel without Trump's approval. There's no theory there. It's kind of scattershot. But they're.
But I think Andrew's going further. Andrew's saying that we on the outside have discussed about have looked at this through a lens of how do they corroborate Cohen. Right. That's because Cohen was out first because he went to jail for his role in covering this up for Donald Trump's campaign. But what I think my point, my understanding of Andrew's point is that so Cohen went in 25 times, I confirmed today, to brag. And clearly what those 25 meetings were, well, what do you know? Who else was there? Well, David Pecker was there. What do you know? Who else was on the phone? Well, Keith Davidson was there. What do you know? Who else was in the room? Hope Hicks was there. So the story the jury will hear isn't in the chronology that we understand it, because Cohen's been public because he went to jail for covering up Donald Trump's relationships with porn stars and playmates. What the jury's hearing is David Pecker's story as Trump's best friend who still reveres him. And then he's hearing from the attorney who tells the same story David Pecker told. And then he'll hear from Hope Hicks, who was in another meeting. And then he saw the tape. By the time Cohen gets up, he'll have to be some guy who, as you said, has been disparaged so many times that is such a, in the words of his detractors, lowlife. He got David Pecker, Hope Hicks, Keith Davidson, the C-SPAN doc. He got all those people to, I mean, that's ludicrous.
Yes and no. I do think that is the chief strategy here of the DA, is to build it not with him. I'll bet we see him in the middle of the case somewhere, try to get him off quickly. But on the other hand, the centerpiece for sure of what the defense will do will try to keep him on the stand 2-3 days. And as I say, that's definitely the goal, and they're doing it effectively. I just don't know if they can totally circle.
What if they don't call him?
That won't happen. Andrew Weissman, any disagreement there?
No, I think they're going to call him. To Harry's point, they do need to remember the core of the charge are the false business records. Now, those are completely connected to the scheme that David Pecker and Keith Davidson have laid out. So the reason it's a felony is there. The who's benefiting is there. And frankly, the whole idea of why you would create false business records is there. In other words, it's integral to the scheme that no one knows about the scheme. So you're not going to write business records that say, these are my payments to a porn star. So, but I do think that there is a piece that you're going to want to get from him. But, you know, this is a very skilled trial team. They did the Trump org case, which led to a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, a criminal case. And they knew how to put on Jeff McConney, a Trump organization hostile witness. So they're going to distance themselves from Michael Cohen. And so I think they'll do quite well with him.
All right, there's so much more around this motive, around the time capsule that Vaughn and I keep trying to bring everybody back to. In the release, it was political carnage when that Access Hollywood tape came out. We'll come back to where the testimony focused in on that. We'll continue to monitor what's happening right now. Keith Davidson is still on the stand right now. Everyone sticks around. Still to come, we'll talk to an attorney who's prosecuted mob cases and mob bosses. We'll look at how a judge like Judge Juan Merchan could protect both the jurors and the witnesses should Trump's taunts get any more vitriolic in this very high-profile criminal trial of an American ex-president. And later in the broadcast, in his own words, the ex-president previewing just how far he would go if he's reelected to the presidency. Can the Democratic guardrails in this country hold if that happens? We'll talk about that and much, much more when Deadline White House continues
to poison the mind of the American voter. Every woman lied when they came forward to hurt my campaign.
If 5% of the people think it's true, and maybe 10% think we don't win.
So the dates on those public remarks from Trump, October 22nd, October 14th, both those were entered into evidence today. Lachlan, this testimony also presented to the jury. Prosecutors, in the summer of 2016, did you come to learn about the release of something known as the Access Hollywood tape? Keith Davidson, yes. What impact, if any, did the release of the Access Hollywood tape on interest in the Stormy Daniels story? Answer from Keith Davidson, as far as I'm aware, it had tremendous impact. Before Access Hollywood tape came out, there was very little, if any, interest that Gina was trying to sell the Stormy Daniels story. It wasn't until the Access Hollywood tape that the interest reached a crescendo. Tell us who Gina is and tell us the significance of that in your view.
So that's Gina Rodriguez, who was a manager in Los Angeles, also, as David Pecker testified last week, a key source for Dylan Howard. And she was repping Stormy Daniels, as well as a number of other different people. But she gets in touch with Dylan Howard in the summer of 16, shopping Stormy's story. But there's little interest then. And then, again, why the timeline is so essential here, there becomes a lot of interest right after the Access Hollywood tape.
Vaughn, again, Access Hollywood tape comes out. My reporting from someone who was in debate prep with Trump when that dropped was that the thing Trump wanted to do least was go upstairs and face Melania. When he finally did, the story I heard is she was in a white bathrobe and she was crying when they got upstairs. And what Trump kept saying in the elevator up was, is that Trump on the tape talking about himself in the third person? This was a crisis for his campaign. Reince Priebus, who was on the Trump campaign, wanted to take him off the ticket. Nobody would go on the Sunday shows except Rudy. And a lot of people thought the campaign was over. Enter the Stormy Daniels story.
And it was a Republican Party that was still trying to justify largely the crassness of Donald Trump and the man who had suddenly become their nominee rather unexpectedly. For much of the brass that continued to operate inside the Republican Party, from Speaker Paul Ryan to Texas Senator Ted Cruz to Marco Rubio to Reince Priebus, Sean Spicer, these were folks that had long been a part of this Republican Party predating Donald Trump. And look, at Mike Pence joined the ticket as the evangelical Christian from Indiana, who was supposed to go and make the case to millions of Americans that this was a good, decent Christian man, Donald Trump, that he is worthy of your vote. And this moment only raised the specter for them of the difficulty of making that case and potentially jeopardizing their own credibility beyond, with the expectation that Donald Trump loses in November, beyond that, because at one point in time, they had stood on stage and defended Donald Trump or his actions. And, I was with Mike Pence there on that very day. We landed in Indiana. He canceled the campaign stop the following day in Wisconsin. This was a moment where there was talk of whether Mike Pence is going to stay on the ticket or not. This was a turbulent period of time. I remember even there was a campaign event in Ohio where Jim Jordan came, and it was kind of like, oh, Congressman Jim Jordan is actually here, right? And now it's kind of funny to look back on that moment that anybody would question that Jim Jordan would come to an event, a Trump campaign event, let alone one with Mike Pence. But that was the substance of the time, was being surprised that Jim Jordan was willing to still stick his neck out for Donald Trump after the Access Hollywood tape. I mean, these were dire times here. And for those following weeks, it was one of those where folks were talking, I remember among journalists, who's going to run in 2020 on the Republican side. It wasn't even about Donald Trump. And at that point in time, I mean, having another story drop at that point, talk about the final explosion. I mean, it would have been incomprehensible almost at that point.
Correct. And I guess, Andrew Weissman, the legal significance of this sort of political context is that even Trump believed this to be the case. Because Trump, after David Pecker said, quote, "I am not a bank," end quote, became the bank. And that's why the testimony that began the day today was with Michael Cohen's banker. And again, anyone that's dealt with Michael Cohen could arrive at any of these personal conclusions. But to your point and Harry's point about the crux of the crime is around the payment that was fraudulently presented to cover up payments to women to impact the election. And I want to read you a little more testimony that goes exactly to Trump's motives to do that, to commit those financial fraud crimes. What did you say, the prosecutor asked? These are texts between Keith Davidson and Dylan Howard on October 8th, right after the Access Hollywood tape comes out. Answer, I said Trump is effed. You wrote the whole word out. I did. What prompted you to say that? The Access Hollywood tape. How did Dylan Howard respond? Answer, wave the white flag. It's over, people. Even in Trump's world, it was, quote, over. And Stormy Daniels would have been the final nail in the coffin, Andrew.
Look, the defense has a very, very hard road here to come up with some plausible story, a narrative that is different, because you have to disbelieve, as you pointed out, too many witnesses and too many sources of evidence. You have to believe that all of this was going on to benefit Donald Trump. He just happened to benefit, but he didn't know about it. And it all took him by surprise. And yet it also was not just benefiting him, it was benefiting him, particularly with respect to Stormy Daniels, at a time that, as you and Vaughn are talking about, was so absolutely critical to his campaign. And you now have, in his own words, the jury hearing that he thought it was critical to his campaign. So you would really have to believe that Michael Cohen did all of this and then somehow was reimbursed and is having all of these phone calls with Donald Trump, but none of this was anything that Donald Trump knew anything about at all. It just becomes so implausible as to why you would be doing that. I mean, remember, Michael Cohen had sort of bragging rights for this. In other words, this isn't something that he would sheepishly tell Donald Trump he's doing under this theory. He'd be like going, look what I did for you, boss, like a dog coming in with a pheasant in its mouth. Like, I was able to come up with the money to pay off Stormy Daniels and be the bank that David Pecker was refusing. So it's like, I am your new David Pecker, and I actually took out a frigging home equity line of credit in order to do it. So, I just think that it's a very hard job to figure out what is the counter narrative.
How it works is you got a 98% offset, okay? There's big gaps here is when you're selling a whole bunch of electricity back to the utility company.